Are we social animals? Well, yeah, it's pretty obvious. I don't think anyone in this class will need convincing that we are animals that socialize. But among the many types of evidence one can garner for just how social we are, that source of evidence would be animation. And what you see below here is a screen capture from an animation that is very minimalistic. That is, the animation simply consists of what you see here: two triangles, a circle, and a rectangle. And yet, when this animation starts, what the viewer sees is instantly a social interaction. And personalities develop in these shapes. Now, if you click on the link, or rather on the screen capture itself, it is linked to YouTube to show you this video, but note that when you do click on that link, that it's going to drop you out of PowerPoint. And once you have finished watching the video on YouTube, you can re-engage your PowerPoint starting with the second slide, and it should pick up fine. So again, the purpose of the video is to show you that even though there's very little information on the screen, your brain makes a social interpretation of this situation within a matter of hundreds of milliseconds. That's how deeply social the human brain is. So, what is social psychology? Scientific study of how individuals think, feel, and behave in social contexts. Okay, so social, of course, is key here. Lots of areas of psychology study how people think, maybe how they feel, certainly how they behave, but they don't all do it with necessarily a focus on how the social setting impacts what we're thinking, what we're feeling, and how we're behaving. So social psychology is really focused on that profound impact that society has on our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. It's distinct from sociology insofar as social psychology is focused on the individual. How does as you see in the definition, how do individuals think, feel, and behave? Sociology, more strictly, is how do the individuals in a group impact the group? So social psychology is asking about individuals and how groups impact the individuals. Sociology is asking about the groups and how the individuals impact the group. Okay, so social psychology focused on the person, sociology focused on the group. As with all things, there are gray areas in these regions, and you can probably find people in sociology departments that sound like social psychologists, and perhaps people in psychology departments that sound more like sociologists. But either way, the basic distinction is the unit of analysis. Is it the individual, or is it the group or the society? Social psychology relies on the scientific method. Okay, so it is a science. No need to, so many psychology classes, you have that debate in those classes, but I'm not going to bother here. It absolutely is a science, precisely because it follows this particular method. It makes systematic observations. You make observations about the world around you. You make observations about people and the people that live with dogs, for instance. And how does that, I think maybe I want to hypothesize, because I'm a dog lover, I want to hypothesize that people that live with dogs are more empathic than people who, well, say live with cats, because I really don't like cats. Sorry. Please don't devalue me on the evaluations at the end of the semester for that if you're a cat lover. But, when it comes to sociality, dogs rock. So I think people who live with dogs are more empathic. I don't necessarily think that, but that's the hypothesis here. It's the observation I'm going to make. I describe that, well, I see a lot of eye contact compared to what you get with living with cats. They don't seem to make eye contact nearly as much. They don't seem to be as much into touch and being close together. So how can I decide whether people who live with dogs are more empathic than people who live with cats, I can measure their level of empathy. And I'm going to hypothesize that the dog livers, the longer cider, that those people are more empathic in this measurement than are cat lovers. I'm testing the theory. Empathy is greater. And so whatever the results may be, they are what they are. You interpret them as a scientist and you move on. So what are some examples of social psychology questions? Well, this table here gives you quite a few. I'll just point out about three. If we look under social perception, one area of study, and by the way, this is chapter 5, but this is actually from a textbook I used many years ago that I no longer use. So chapter 5 doesn't really pertain here. But the question still pertains, which is where do stereotypes come from and why are they so resistant to change? Okay, so this could be under the social psychological area of social perception. What affects the way we perceive ourselves and others? Obviously, stereotypes and prejudices are forms of perceiving other people. If we want to talk instead about social influence, how do we influence each other? One idea is how do people sometimes trick us into buying things we never really wanted? Okay, so that's a question that is social in nature as well. And under social interaction, does exposure to TV violence or to pornography trigger aggressive behavior? Okay, so aggression is a social behavior, right? If you were the only person on the planet, presumably you wouldn't be able to show aggression unless it were to some other animal, which could be argued to be a social interaction, even if it's a lion that's trying to eat you or something, right? So aggression is by definition a social behavior, and TV, of course, is a very social phenomenon, as is pornography, etc. So we can ask at least these three different groups of questions: social perception, social influence, and social interaction. And then you could even look down below there and talk about applied social psychology. So why do people sometimes confess to crimes they did not commit? That's a real phenomenon, and it's a social phenomenon, right? The individuals sitting there in the chair in the interview room at the police station, they're interacting with police officers, the good cop, bad cop kind of thing, right? All of these are social situations, and so while social psychologists up here in the first three categories can be much more theoretical, much more science driven, not that the bottom isn't science driven, but the bottom example, applying social psychology, is driven by science to the goal of helping understand questions about law, business, and health. These are applied uses of the science rather than the science for the science sake, as it were. So in furtherance of our effort to understand what social psychology is and what kind of questions social psychologists address, let's consider something from the arena of political psychology. Political psychology is social psychology. Of course, politics is nothing if not a social interaction. So it's perfectly within the purview of social psychology to study politics and how the human psyche impacts political discourse, interactions, elections. Maybe you want to know what makes a successful debate performance for, say, a presidential candidate. Well, the study we're talking about now addressed Ronald Reagan's debate performance back in the 80s, where he was actually viewed quite favorably in terms of his performance. And in fact, true to his character, he threw several one-liner jokes into his debate performance, and most of those jokes were successful, meaning that the audience laughed, and that generally seems to have helped Reagan's performance. So the researchers in the study we're discussing addressed the question, was it the jokes themselves that elevated Reagan's perceived performance, or was it the jokes with the laughter? As we all are familiar, it's kind of embarrassing when you tell a joke and nobody laughs. tend to look, rather than looking favorable. There's my dog, not enjoying political psychology, or maybe she's just opposed to Ronald Reagan, I'm not sure. But is it the jokes or is it the laughter with the jokes that is critical? And so the way they addressed this question was by looking at participants' ratings of Reagan's performance. That is, they brought in a bunch of naive participants and had them view the unedited video of Reagan's performance, and he got high approval ratings, up around 65% of the people rated Reagan's performance as favorable. Now, the question is, what happens if we take the jokes out? So jokes and reaction are edited out. That is, the jokes as well as the laughter are taken out, so that you hear Reagan's performance minus the jokes, minus the laughter that went with the jokes. And that seemed to have very little impact on Reagan's overall favorability, which is quite interesting. Even without the jokes, he's still performing at nearly the same level. Now, let's take out the laughter but leave the jokes in. And in this case, the favorability rating went down quite far, down below 50%, showing that it's not so much the jokes that are critical, but the laughter that accompanies the jokes. If that laughter is not there, then the perceived ratings of Reagan go down. The perception of Reagan would appear to be that he's not very funny, that he's not connecting with the audience, and that has a detrimental effect to the overall perception of the candidate's performance. So again, with the jokes in, he got a high favorability rating. Even with the jokes out, he still got a high favorability rating. If you put the jokes back in, but take the laughter out, then you actually get a rather low rating of favorability, because the jokes appeared to have fallen flat on their faces, right? No laughter suggests that the audience didn't think he was funny. And if the audience didn't think he was funny, then apparently the participants in the study also did not think he was funny. So the social context in which the debate occurs has a profound impact on the performance of the individual. If you, as an audience member, perceive the rest of the audience to think that Reagan is funny, then you have high favorability ratings. If, on the other hand, you have the impression that the audience does not believe he's funny because the laughter has been edited out, then that tends to lower your opinion of him. So your opinion of Reagan as an audience member is quite impacted by what you perceive other people's opinions to be. So very social component to a political psychology experiment, and very useful to just do. Let's do a little bit more in terms of differentiating social psychology from other arenas. So for instance, we've mentioned earlier that social psychology focuses on the individual while sociology focuses on groups. So in this example, we have sociology looking at or tracking how Americans' prejudice toward Japanese has changed since World War II. We're all familiar with the prejudice shown toward Japanese and the internment camps that were put in during World War II. What they're looking at is not what individuals think about the Japanese since World War II, but what do Americans as a whole think? So the group level of analysis. Now let's look at clinical psychology. There we see the idea of testing various therapies for people with antisocial personalities who exhibit great degree of prejudice. So these are for individual people we're looking at, and it happens to be for something called antisocial personality disorder, and that right there means you're looking at a clinical psychology experiment. You're not just simply trying to understand antisocial personality disorder for antisocial personality disorder's sake. You're trying to understand it from the context of how it impacts the individual and how can we improve therapy for these people. Okay, so clinical psychology is very applied in most instances. Personality psychology can be seen in the example of developing a questionnaire to identify men who are very high or low in degree of prejudice toward women. Okay, so this is looking at the individual. It's using a questionnaire to look at personality and perceptions of personality. Now, we next go to cognitive psychology, which was we'll say founded in the mid 20th century, somewhat as a reaction to behaviorism. Recall that behaviorism says that psychological scientists can only look at behavior. You can't talk about mental states because you can't see them. Cognitive psychology came along in about 30 or 40 years after the advent of behaviorism and said, no, wait a minute, behavior's fine, but there are mental states in the human mind, and we believe we can study them. So in this example, they manipulate the exposure to a member of some category of people and measure the thoughts and concepts that are automatically activated. As noted here, a study of prejudice in this field would, by definition, be at the intersection of cognitive and social psychology. As happens with all areas of science, the borders between different areas of science is not so clear. So cognitive psychology can bleed into social psychology. But the main thing to understand here is we're looking at mental states, and prejudices are mental states, and we're looking at whether they're automatically activated or whether the person has to actively work to activate a prejudice. And then finally, in this example, they for social psychology, they talk about manipulating various kinds of contact between individuals of different groups and examining the effect of these manipulations on the degree of prejudice exhibited. So this is more explicitly about the prejudice and the prejudicial behavior. And what we're manipulating is the kinds of contacts between individuals of different groups. Okay. And in that sense, we're looking at the social impacts of prejudice or the social derivatives of prejudice. And I forgot to advance these, but there are the key terms. Sociology is looking at groups, clinical psychology is looking at therapy, personality psychology often uses questionnaires, although social psychology uses questionnaires a lot as well. And indeed, some people would say personality psychology is just a subset of social psychology. Cognitive psychology is looking specifically at thoughts. Okay? And social psychology, again, I highlighted the individual here because that's what distinguishes it from the groups that sociologists look at. So, a very brief bit of history about social psychology. One of the founding fathers of social psychology is Gordon Allport, and he revolutionized, or that's probably too strong a word, he frontiered the study of attitudes. What are attitudes and how do they impact a person's beliefs, desires, their behaviors more specifically? And these attitudes are generally social in nature. It's hard to have an attitude about something without that being some sort of social attitude. Next, we'll mention Kurt Lewin, who believed behavior was a function of the person and the situation. Not a terribly controversial statement. However, this comes on the heels of behaviorism that said that, well, it's really the situation that we're looking at and the behaviors. The person here kind of reflects the inner states. And according to behaviorism, again, it's not okay to be looking at these inner states. Kurt Lewin nonetheless said, well, it's critical, and we want to see how these inner states of the person interact with the situation that they're in. And that situation is usually or always going to be social to one extent or another. It's important to know that Kurt Lewin fled Nazi Germany, and so he was influenced, as many social psychologists in the 20th century were, by the Nazi Germany, Holocaust, and other horrific things that happened during World War II. This raised a lot of questions for folks. How is it that so many Germans could be complicit in something like the Holocaust? Is there something particularly insidious about or diabolical about Germans? Probably not. So what social psychologists have been doing ever since the World War II is trying to figure out what social context, what social dynamics can lead an otherwise good person to do really horrible things, such as happened in Germany. And of course, it's happened in many places. I mean, it's happened in the United States, the things that we did to Native Americans, the things that we've done to African Americans. Otherwise good European American individuals have brought themselves to do really horrific things, probably not because they're just evil people deep down in their soul, but rather because they're people that were in a particular type of social situation that drew the worst behaviors out of them. So Lewin believed that behavior equals the person times the environment. That's just what we set up here with the person and the situation. So you've got the person and their beliefs, their values, their attitudes, etc. But an important factor of how the person behaves is the environment that they're in. Now this contrasts to psychoanalysis, which was completely internal, and behaviorism, which was completely external. Psychoanalysis, a la Freud, was always looking toward the id, the ego, and the superego, and a little bit concerned about interactions with mom and so forth, right? But mostly about the internal states. Behaviorism said, these internal states, we have no idea whether they even exist. We can't measure them, therefore we can't study them. So behaviorism said, instead of looking at internal states, we're going to look only at external states, the behavior, hence behaviorism. Lewin pioneered the idea that social psychological theories should be applied to important practical issues. Okay, so again, he was motivated by World War II, having fled Nazi Germany during that time. And so when he got to America, he decided that one way he could contribute to the war effort to defeat the Nazis was to do research on how to persuade Americans at home during World War II to conserve things like copper. Okay, copper was needed for munitions, bullets and artillery and so forth. And in order to get the copper needed for that, the government encouraged American citizens to conserve copper and to donate copper to the government whenever they could in order to help with the war effort. And I throw up Rosie the Riveter, I think I said that wrong, Rosie the Riveter up here. We're all familiar with that really formidable image. This was imagery that came out of research like Lewin's. I'm actually not certain whether Lewin's research led directly to this specific image, but the idea that we could throw imagery out there into the public that would encourage the public to get involved and participate in the war effort, that derives from Lewin's first sets of research looking at how to influence people, how to persuade them to take part in the war effort any way they could. And the third person I mentioned in the history of social psychology is Stanley Milgram. That obnoxious electrical current sound is a cue to remind you that this is a guy who did shock studies, or at least what he claimed were shock studies. In truth, no shock is being delivered to participants, but in his study, he had what we call naive participants come in and press buttons on this apparatus. And it sounded like that apparatus was delivering shock to a Confederate in a different room. So I said Confederate there. What does that mean? Well, if the naive participant is naive, they're just somebody who came in to be a part of the study, then the Confederate is acting like they are also a naive participant, but in fact are in cahoots with the experimenter. So again, in this case, the naive participant was the tester and the Confederate was the subject. And so every time the Confederate would get something, an answer wrong to a question, the naive participant was instructed to push one of these buttons on the shock scale. And as you go up the scale, the shock becomes more and more severe. And the actor, the Confederate in the other room, starts to complain. Then he starts to really complain. Then he starts to yell and scream to let you out, or to let him out of there. And Milgram's question was, how far up this scale are most naive participants going to go? If you just pull the average Joe off the street, will they go all the way to the top? In which case, by the time you get to the top, the actor has already stopped speaking. The implication is the actor is either passed out from sheer pain or perhaps dead in there. You may well have shocked him to death. Or are participants going to stop well short of that? And of course, participants believed they would stop well short of that. Psychiatrists at the time that Milgram asked said that they would stop definitely by the middle of this shock level where the guy is saying, hey, I want to quit now, please let me out. But what Milgram found that in fact is that 2/3 of the participants went all the way to the top. As far as they know, they were killing the man in the other room. And all you had to induce these people to kill the Confederate. Again, he's a Confederate, he's not really dying, no harm is becoming him. However, as a naive subject, you believe he's being harmed. And all you have is Milgram sitting there saying, please go on, the experiment must continue. Okay. So Milgram is inspired by World War II, Nazi atrocities. How could the average German be complicit in the Holocaust? Well, it looks like, based on his studies, is because just mild authoritarianism, like just the mild authority figure that Milgram was. He was not a terribly imposing figure. He was not threatening violence to the naive participants to get them to go up the scale. All he would say, if they would say, look, I want to quit, I'm worried about the guy in there, Milgram would just say, the gentleman in the other room is fine, the experiment must go on, please continue. And that mild bit of authoritarianism pushed participants all the way to the top of this shock scale, pushed participants to kill the man in the other room. And again, these participants, on average, one or two of them may have been a psychopath, but on average, most of them are just on average. They're the average person. So this tells us that the average person, under even mild authoritarian circumstances, can be induced to do really horrific things. Now, this is one of the many things that social psychology has to tell us about the human psyche that is really dark and unfortunate. Nobody likes the fact that most of us can be turned quite easily into killers. However, if that is in fact true, as Milgram's research very strongly suggests, then we need to know that. Because as such, we have a chance of at least making sure we don't let ourselves get into such authoritarian situations. I would argue with a recent presidential administration that there were many flavors of authoritarianism creeping into our system that were different than we had seen before. There's always some level of authoritarianism, obviously. But the Trump administration brought new kinds of authoritarianism in there, and fully half of the country, or well, quite frankly, I'd prefer to think it's more like 30 to 40% of the country, was readily behind that sort of authoritarianism. So we need to be able to recognize when that authoritarianism is on the rise and figure out what we can do to stop it. Because if we let authoritarianism take hold of the government that we live under, then we will be induced to do things, horrific things, that we wouldn't have done under a non-authoritarian government. Just like the average German was complicit with the Holocaust only because they were under the Nazi regime. Had they not been under such an authoritarian regime, they presumably would not have participated in something like the Holocaust. So yes, Milgram's shock experiments are some of the most famous experiments in all of social psychology, indeed in all of psychology, period. They're extremely important. They were also, they're also viewed in retrospect as unethical experiments. We'll talk about that later when we get to, I forget right now which module and which chapter that is, but we will discuss Milgram and his experiments in more detail later on. What Sharif found. He found that when, after 2 weeks of being alone as rattlers and 2 weeks of being alone as eagles, these two groups, after that 2 weeks, were put together in this, kind of camp situation. This was actually at a place called, what was that? Sulphur Canyon, I believe is the name of the national park in Oklahoma. It's no longer a national park because it's kind of lame, and people would go way out of their way to go to this national park only to realize that it was kind of lame, and then they would complain to the National Park Service, so eventually National Park Service took it off of the National Park Registry. But that's neither here nor there. It was a national park when they did this, and after 2 weeks he brought the two groups together and he measured just how much rattlers would fight with eagles versus how much rattlers would fight with rattlers or eagles would fight with eagles. And fighting would be anything from just an argument between two people to an actual threat of a fist fight. And perhaps not surprisingly, infighting within the rattlers was minimal, whereas outfighting, the rattlers fighting with the eagles, was very high in occurrences. Just a couple of weeks of being a rattler was enough to get you to be prejudiced against eagles, even though there was no meaningful difference between these two groups. You just happened to be a rattler totally by chance. Now, another interesting dynamic to this is he had the rattlers and the eagles interact for an additional 2 weeks. And after that time, they actually started to help each other out. So he showed not only does splitting people into different groups profoundly impact their treatment of one another, but that you can actually work to undo that by having these kind of meaningful interactions between members of the two different groups that will start to break down these prejudices. So it's, I would say it's rather disappointing to hear that humans are so easily divided into rattlers versus eagles. You know, look at back to politics, think of Democrats versus Republicans. Just simply believing you're a Republican or, you know, identifying as a Republican is going to elicit some prejudice against Democrats that exists not because the Democrats deserve that prejudice, but because of your propensity as a human being to be allegiant to a Republican and be prejudiced against the Democrats. And of course, it works the other way around. If you identify as a Democrat, then you may have some ideas that are different than the Republicans, but beyond those differences, you're going to have some prejudice toward Republicans simply because they're in the other group. And again, it's important to recognize that. And the upside of this is that he showed that you can undo a lot of that prejudice by having the groups interact during meaningful activities. So that was early 20th century and social psychology, although Milgram actually, his study was first published in 1963. But what is happening in the 50s and 60s? Psychology is getting divided into two camps. There's behaviorism that we mentioned was only looking at behavior. This is where reward and punishment comes from, stimulus and response. And since the late 1800s, we had Freudian psychoanalysis looking at individual experiences and really focused on the internal. So behaviorism focused on the external, psychoanalysis and Freudianism focused on the internal. Now, something that's not on this slide is that around the 50s, actually motivated also by World War II, but less by the prejudices in World War II and more by the development that the computer underwent in the 50s. The computer, or not in the 50s, but really in the 40s during World War II, the computer really came into genuine being in the 40s during World War II. And once we saw that machines could display things like memories, you know, that computers could have memory, psychologists started to say, well, wait a minute, maybe human memory is done just like it's done in a computer. And so the computer metaphor kicked off cognitive psychology. Now, most cognitive psychologists today no longer think of the computer as an adequate metaphor for the mind, but this is how cognitive psychology got its start. Well, by the 60s, we have social psychology coming, putting its brand in the fire, or its iron in the fire, I should say, by combining these methods. It used scientific approaches to measure behavior, like behaviorists did, to measure thoughts, like cognitive psychologists did, and to measure feelings and inner states, like Freudian psychoanalysts did. So social psychology in the mid-20th century really came about to combine all different areas of study. So what do we have kind of in the most recent history of social psychology? Well, social psychologists are studying cognitive processes, so cognitive psychology and social psychology have blended to a fair degree, though they're still considered distinct fields. Nonetheless, social psychologists really use cognitive psychology heavily to look at the cognitive processes that are relevant to social interaction. And one of the major theories to come out of the combination of social psychology and cognitive psychology is attribution theory. And this is a theory that discusses how we make attributions to other individuals to explain their behavior. Now, we'll talk later on in the semester when we get to the module on social cognition. We'll talk quite a bit about attribution theory, as it's been a very important theory in the history of social psychology. And we'll even go on to discuss something called the fundamental attribution error. And that fundamental attribution error, believe it or not, can be tied back to free will. Okay, so I gave you a heavy dose of free will at the very beginning of the semester. I've kind of promised to bring free will up now and again throughout the rest of the semester. Well, attribution theory is one time where this will come up. That is, I'm going to argue that people who believe in free will make the fundamental attribution error more. So when if you believe in free will, then your ability to understand why another person does what they do is impaired by the belief that they have free will. So we'll get to that later in the semester. Another recent area has been the social neurosciences. So this combines biological, or biology we'll say, and evolutionary processes to create social neuroscience. So in the 90s, we had the advent of cognitive neuroscience. This was the combination of brain imaging techniques such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, electroencephalography, and a host of other tools. The combination of those neuroscience tools with cognitive psychological studies. So in the 90s, cognitive neuroscience came into being. Well, somewhere around the year 2010, you started hearing the term social neuroscience or even social cognitive neuroscience. So it was in the early 2000s to the late 2000s, up around 2010, that social psychologists started to realize, hey, these theories, like perhaps attribution theory that we've been interested in testing, we can test these not just with questionnaires or behavioral studies, but we could also test our theories by looking at neuroscience measures of the brain. Hence, social neuroscience came into being. And this is what I consider myself, a social neuroscientist, someone whose main training is in cognitive neuroscience, and I have secondarily picked up social psychology to combine these two. And what I look at is the brain processes related to empathy and compassion. If you're familiar with mirror neurons, then I would mention that I look at mirror neurons and see how they enable us to empathize with other people and how that empathy enables us to feel compassion for them. So I'm happy outside of class time to at any point to entertain questions or thoughts anybody has on social neuroscience, specifically on empathy and compassion. And since I'm mentioning that, I do have a lab that does research in that area, and I'm always interested in motivated students that want to get involved in that kind of research. And even if you aren't interested particularly in that kind of research, I'd like to point out to you that our department has somewhere around 20 research active faculty. That is, we have about 20 different labs in the psychology department at Northern Arizona University, and I encourage you as an undergraduate to get involved in some of that research as soon as possible. Don't wait for your senior year. In some ways, your senior year is too late. I'm not saying, if you happen to be a senior in this class, I'm not saying don't bother getting involved in research. It's too late. But if you can get involved prior to your senior year, that's best. I mean, on rare occasions, some students will get involved in research in their freshman year. It's much more common, however, to get involved in your sophomore year and certainly by your junior year. But if you have any thoughts of going on in psychology or really any kind of science after you finish your bachelor's here, then in order to get into a good psychology graduate program, or really even to an average psychology program, you're going to need to have a substantial amount of research experience. Any graduate program is going to require some level of research knowledge, and that knowledge is going to come not from taking regular classes like this social psychology class. It's going to come from participating in actual research studies. And when I say participate, I don't mean as a participant, as a subject. I mean as a researcher, somebody who is running a study. So I strongly encourage you to talk to me or to other faculty in the department. You can certainly look at the NAU Psychological Sciences webpage for faculty and see what each of our different areas of research is. And whichever one of those research areas you find particularly interesting, I encourage you to email that professor and ask if you could have a meeting to discuss the possibility of getting involved in their research. So, study of cognitive processes in social psychology has led to attribution theory. The study of biological and evolutionary processes in social psychology has led to social neuroscience. The self has become a very popular topic within social psychology, and you might think, well, wait, how is the self social? Well, the self is social. Sometimes it might seem like it's the exact opposite. I'm talking about the individual, not the group that the person's involved in. Well, social psychologists like to argue that the self-concept, self-esteem, self-presentation, that these things only exist for social animals. If you have animals that, you think of animals that are non-social, which I'm not sure I can come up with the best example for you at the moment. Perhaps crabs may not be social. I believe that's chapter 2 in the book that really talks about social animals versus cultural animals. But in order to have a sense of self, an animal has got to be a social animal. That without being able to interact socially with other members of your species, there's no way to develop a concept of self. This school of thought even says that the first person a human becomes aware of is not himself or herself or themselves. The first person a human becomes aware of is the primary caregiver, in many cases mom. So this argument suggests that the self is so fundamentally social that you don't even have a sense of self until after you've developed a sense of other people. And once you've developed a sense of other people like mom, then you can recognize, wait a minute, this mom thing keeps looking here at this location, and every time she does, there's this experience of joy, excitement, of reward. Hey, there's another person. There's not just mom. There's a me here. Now that's all very simplified the way I put that, but just to give you the gist, we'll talk about that when we get to the section on the self. And then social psychology has been turned to the study of group conflicts, which can involve political psychology. It can involve the psychology of race, the psychology of ethnicity. Any groups that appear to be in conflict with each other, social psychologists often are interested in studying the nature of those conflicts. And they're often, from that social activism point of view, they're often interested in trying to decrease the amount of conflict between the groups on the assumption that we all want that we believe the world is a better place, the less conflict is. I'll go ahead and mention your book talks about the ABCs of social psychology. That just refers to affect, behavior, and cognition. These are the three general areas that social psychology looked at, the three types of phenomena they try to study. Affect being emotion, you can see in this really awful face here. Behavior, of course, is obvious enough. And then cognition, your thoughts and your beliefs and so forth. So these are the three major components of psychology.
I thought for the first chapter, I'd start by saying a little bit about
slide,
what
there's
got
a
me
video
into
embedded
social psychology.
by
Let
the
me
author of your
begin by
textbook,
saying I feel very
Roy
lucky to be a
Baumeister.
social psychologist. It's sort
And
of like
he's going to talk
that I have
about
a hobby that I've managed to make
what
into a
social
career that
psychologists
can
do,
pay
what
the
kind of
rent and
opportunities
take care
there
of
are
me in other
within social
respects.
psychology.
After all, what's more
I
interesting
am
than people?
not 100% sure the
Studying
best
people.
way to
Most people show plenty of
do
interest in
this
people
when
in
I'm
their,
sitting
in
and
their private
recording
lives. If
these
you look at
PowerPoints
what
with
people
voice
do when they
narration.
go home, what
I
do
don't
they
think I'm
watch
going
on
to bother
television, what
to
do they
play
read novels
the
about, what
video
do they read about in the
as
paper
it stands
and
right
movies.
now,
It's people.
but I
They're
do
all
believe
interested in
once
people.
you've got access
Well,
to this
social
PowerPoint,
psychologists are
although
lucky enough
you won't
that
have access
we're
to
able
PowerPoint,
to
you'll actually
spend
have access
not just
to
our leisure time, but even our work time thinking about people and trying
video
to
recording,
figure
an
out and
MP4
understand,
file on YouTube.
understand
So,
people.
so you actually won't be able to click and
This has
play
been a very
this.
satisfying
Maybe, I'm not 100%
occupation
sure this will
to
work. I'm going to go
have.
ahead and try and click it. And
How
maybe
I
will
actually
just
got
let it
into
run.
it, I was in college
If
at a
I can
time of
get it to
transition
play.
when students were
Let's
changing the way
drop out.
they chose what to
Pointer.
major in and what to specialize in. The students older than myself, the students who were in college, say in the 1960s, that was a time when the economy was really good, so students didn't worry about making money or having being able to afford a living when they graduated from college. Instead, there were great social upheaval and great concern with how society should be changed. And so during the 60s, many students chose what to major in based on what would be personally fulfilling or would help them implement their plans for changing society. Relevance was the term that you heard a lot. People wanted a major that would be relevant both to their personal satisfaction and to the important goals of society. By the late 1970s, the economy had turned bad, and I think there was also a sense that a lot of the social activism of the 60s hadn't really been as successful as people wanted. So by then, students were choosing majors based on what they thought would get them a good, secure job and what would position them well for the job market after graduation. Well, I was in college in between those two, so we were kind of affected by both, and lots of us came to psychology because it seemed one ideal blend. It had relevance in the sense that it offered a way to understand personal problems and social problems, and you could apply it to your own life and to society and so forth. But it also had many job opportunities, so you could have some confidence that when you graduated you would be able to make a living for it. And I was hardly the only one who had this idea. All over the country, people were suddenly starting to major in psychology in much larger numbers. I know at my college, they've been used to having 15 or 20 psychology majors a year. Suddenly they were having over 100. Of course, this was a disaster for the department. The faculty were tearing out their hair and they, what do we do with all these students? But as far as we were concerned, that was their problem. And I think, again, reflected the appeal of psychology and indeed social psychology as offering both useful steps for a career and useful personal and social insights. What I most wanted out of life, and what I still do, is I really want to understand what human life is all about. I've always been interested in the grand questions. What is the meaning of life? What makes happiness? Why is there evil? How do people, do people have free will? Issues and questions like this, and to me, social psychology has offered a way of getting at and understanding those questions. Admittedly, it's not just sitting in your armchair thinking about them, but working under the discipline of the experimental method and trying to prove your answers. Still, it's a way to spend your life working and thinking about these great questions and applying them and trying to make a little progress, finding out some new knowledge that can contribute to answers to those. So to me, that's been an important part of the appeal. And I think all these come together in the way we've tried to put together this textbook. Do we want to present social psychology first as a way to learn about people? And indeed, the title, Social Psychology and Human Nature, is our way already of showing that we want to use social psychology to help understand some of these basic things about people. So we hope it will provide you with lots of specific facts and findings, interesting little new insights into how people react to this or that sort of situation or problem or dilemma. Also, I hope it'll provide information that'll be useful to people in their careers. That includes not just psychology careers, but also business careers or healthcare or law or wherever you go. Many professions will have to deal with people in some way, and so having some understanding of what social psychologists have learned could be useful, and we've tried to bring that out in the textbook too. And for those people who are interested in the grand questions about the meaning of life and human nature and so forth, well, we think social psychology has something to contribute to that too, and that too we have tried to bring in from time to time throughout the different chapters in the book.